Hello and welcome to the Fat Squirrel Speaks. Today is Wednesday, July 31st, and this is a bonus episode. So I'm your hostess, Amy Beth, also known as the Fat Squirrel on Ravelry and the Fat SQRRL on Instagram. If you're looking for a regular podcast, this isn't one. This is a special bonus episode in which I'll be talking about a finished object that I've completed recently, the Magpie Tendency by Melissa Alexander Loomis, who's also known as Skeanigans. These bonus episodes are made possible by folks who contribute to the podcast via Patreon and PayPal. You can find information directly in the little drop down for links to how you can make that happen if that's something you're interested in doing. So everybody just send out a big thank you to them. Second thank yous coming their way. Okay, so let's get into it. So this pattern, as I say, Skeanigans, Melissa Alexander Loomis. So I apologize, I'm going to insert this, I forgot to mention it. The size range of the pattern, hugely important, right? 35 inches to 72.5 inches, or 90 centimeters to 185 centimeters. And it is intended to have 6 to 12 inches or 15 to 30 centimeters of ease. So she specifically says choose a size that is 6 to 12 inches larger than your full bust measurement. Okay? So I should also talk about the different color blocking options that are available. So the pattern, the image on the front is a solid color, so you just use one color throughout. You can also use it with a mini skein. So you have an option that looks like this. So your little epaulets, essentially, and your I-cord are the mini skein, as is the I-cord bind off, I believe. So it's cute, just like a little accent detail. And then the version that I most closely approximated is this one, where you do a full skein for the yoke and then another skein for the body. The top part of the sweater is Quince & Company Finch. So they're fingering 100% American wool. I think it's American wool. In the apricot colorway. And then the bottom part is handspun that was gifted to me by an awesome viewer. So here I'll put up the sweater on my human body. So here it is on my actual human body. So here is my natural waist. So this one is actually, what is that? Maybe 3 inches shorter than my natural waist? 2, probably 3. Well, maybe 2 because it's more like here. Okay. This is my bra line right here. The bottom of my bra band is right here. Okay, so to give you an idea on the side and the back. So this is great. These cropped sweaters are great if you are not sure how to add shaping to fit your butt. If your butt is delicious and shelf-like and you're not sure how to accommodate that, it's not hard. You add darts like you would for your bust, but for your butt. However, if you feel intimidated by that, maybe this is your first garment, or it's the first garment for you, or whatever, then having a sweater that hits above that is really easy because you don't have to add any shaping. You can just use your measurement, your back measurement essentially, and you're going to have a good fit. Otherwise, when you do a sweater that is hip length and you don't add any shaping to it, okay, you get this tenting effect where you just look like you have a bolster pillow back here. Which, whatever. You do you. I do like my sweaters to not do that. So, cropped is a great way to get around it. I feel like I can't tell if I'm crooked or the camera's a little crooked. What else do you need to see on my body? Maybe I should zoom in so you're not seeing less of my legs. I don't know. Yeah. There it is. Oh, I think you got a side view when I did that. And then, so you didn't get a full back view. Sorry if I'm off center. I cannot see you. Here I am again. Ding. So in this podcast, I'll talk mostly about what I did differently, what I might do differently in the future, my yarn choices, all that kind of good stuff that goes into thinking about how to do a sweater. So let's get to like the brick and mortar of the situation. I wanted to give you my finished measurements so you can kind of get an idea of like how much ease I did and like all of that stuff. Okay, so my finished circumference of the sweater after it's been worn, so after it's been washed, blocked, worn, the finished circumference of my sweater as it's lying flat, okay, you know what I mean, so I measured a half and doubled, is 55 inches. Now, I'm 56 inches, so mathematically that means I have mathematically, whatever. I have a negative 1 inch of ease. Now, most of these crop sweaters are knitted with positive ease. I just knew that I had minimal yarn to use, and so I was going to go for a more snug fit. I will say that I took this sweater to Super Summer Knit Together for the Try It On room, and folks tried it on who were significantly smaller than me. I did not ask them for their bust measurements, but folks who were significantly smaller than me, and it looked cute with a lot of positive ease. And then you can see what it looks like on me with basically a negative inch of positive ease. Now, is that negative inch actually true? No, because when you put it on, it automatically stretches. For example, my gauge on the apricot part is 5.5 stitches to the inch if it's lying flat. Okay, that's been washed, that's been blocked, that's been worn. When I actually put it on my body, it stretches to 4 stitches to the inch. Okay, so even though lying flat on a table, this sweater has negative ease, on my body, it ends up having positive ease. You can see if I very like scientifically put my arms up, there is still flow. It's not like snug on my body. So that effect is greatly exaggerated the larger the circumference of a sweater you're making. If you're making a 34-inch bust circumference, it's not going to have that much difference because we're talking about a percentage of stretch essentially, or a percentage of growth on the body. I don't know what that's technically called. But you can make it make sense. So like if it's a percentage, right, a greater effect the larger the circumference is. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Like a lot of us want to knit, like if you're fat, a lot of folks want to, even if you're not fat, there's this mentality of like, oh, I'll just knit it bigger so that I know it'll go on my body. Okay, I won't have that fear of like knitting something and then it not being able to go on my body. But that really, again, the larger you are, it tends to be the bigger that effect is, because you think, oh, I can just kind of like, it'll skim. And what in fact happens is your sweater is heavier, so it stretches more, period. Then you have a greater circumference for that percentage of growth to work over. And you end up, those like kind of just snowball, and you end up with a garment that's really big on you. So just FYIs in your planning process, I guess. So yeah, and so also my top gauge is different. My yoke gauge is different than my body gauge. So my yoke, and these are both measured flat, not on my body. My yoke gauge is something like 5.5 stitches to the inch, where the body gauge is more like 5 stitches to the inch. So that's another great way if you do have a larger bust. You don't have to necessarily add or decrease or work with stitch differences. You might get a little bit more room, because see, my full bust happens after I make that transition. So it gives you a little bit more wiggle room with getting a little bit bigger circumference, so you can have a slightly smaller fit here. Now, with this being a drop shoulder, it's not as big of an issue. Like when I was figuring out what size I wanted to knit, usually on a regular like raglan or a set-in sleeve or even a yoke, I will think more about knitting a smaller size than my full bust. Like my underbust is 46, my full bust is 56. So I will usually cast on for something closer to that 46. With a drop shoulder, you have a lot more leeway in that fit, because it's not meant to sit here. So, if I'm knitting a set-in sleeve and I knit my full bust versus my upper bust, my sleeve yoke is going to be like down here, and it's going to look like it's not fitting on my body right. To me. Do other people notice? I don't know or care. But to me, I can see that doesn't fit and it looks and feels sloppier to me. But with this drop shoulder, not a problem. It just makes the drop longer, which unless you're really concerned about making a mega short sleeve, is not going to be an issue for you, right? So, I mean, at some point you're going to like have a neckline that's too flash dancey, but as long as you're relatively close, you're fine. So what I'm saying is basically this is an easier fit if you're not sure how to fit a sweater to your body. A drop shoulder, a lot of people will be like, don't do drop shoulder, blah, 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 blah. Whatever. People tell you not to knit a raglan if you're over 14. Those people are ridiculous. I mean, I'm sure they're lovely people, but I don't need your advice. Thank you. And I even have had concerns about knitting a drop shoulder. I wasn't sure if I would like it, but they're totally fine. Gives you a little bit more leeway in terms of like figuring out what size. You don't have to worry as much about adding stitches for the bust and figuring that all out. You can just cast on for your full bust measurement, like that size, or with ease or negative ease or positive ease, whatever you need. And you're not as concerned about, oh, I have a different proportion from this part to this part of my body. I have a non-standard proportion. That's baloney talk. But you know what I mean. Like, I don't adhere to the standard proportion set out by the garment industry. Okay? Okay. I feel like that was a lot more talking than I meant to do about that, but there you go. I'm still talking about finished measurements. Okay? Okay. So my entire depth, so measured from, there's not a shoulder seam per se, but again, lying flat on a table, it is 17.5 inches from top to bottom. And I have a 19-inch circumference on my armhole. Now that again is slightly negative ease for me, just very slightly, but that's totally up to your taste and what have you. If you're a person that has a smaller arm at like your armpit essentially than you do further down, so if you have like the growing bicep like I do, it gives you a little bit more leeway because with the drop shoulder, you can slightly fudge your pickup rate. So for example, in this sweater, I might have 19 inches at the actual armhole, but I can maybe do a pickup of 4 to 5 instead of 3 to 4, or do a pickup of 9 to 10 instead of 4 to 5. I can get a few extra stitches in there so that when I'm knitting down, my sleeve gets a little bit bigger. You don't want it to look, I mean, I don't necessarily want it to look puckered. That's more of a different style aesthetic. But it gives you a little bit more room if you need some bigger circumference for like lower down in your bicep. And I think that's how most folks' arms are proportioned if you're carrying weight in your arm. I think that usually, you know, here is a little bit of a smaller circumference and it grows as you go down. I don't know, but that seems like what I kind of just see in the world. Okay. Okay, that's finished measurements. What else do we need to talk about? Okay. So here I'll put in how this sweater looks on my bust in terms of where the change from main color to yoke color to body color happens. Okay, so on my body you can see this, you know, you can see where the change happens from the shoulder color to the body color. Okay, if I had done the pattern as written, this would have ended 1, 2, 3 3 repeats of the texture. Look, right? Is it 3? 1, 2. Yeah, that's correct. So it would have landed 1, 2, 3. So it would have landed, it's technically not on my full bust. 4 would have been my full bust. But it's pretty darn close. So I think if I do this sweater again, I would definitely do it at least this short, the top panel, the yoke essentially. I might even do it 1 repeat shorter, depending on my yardage and whatnot. Oh, and so I also should show you this. Okay, so I wanted to show you this as well in terms of where this, how it changes how the sleeve looks if you end your yoke color a bit higher. And I'm totally okay with that. I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm totally okay with how that looks. So if you had a greater contrast, I mean, there is a lot of contrast between these two yarns in terms of one of being hand spun and one is just a solid commercial. Maybe though, if you had like a higher value contrast, it might be more noticeable. But when you put your arm down, if you're at all shaped like me, meaning your arms are very fluffy, you cannot even see it. And I still don't think, even, you know, when my arm is up, I don't think you really notice it per se. But I wanted to see what that looked like as well. So I hope you can see there, I did 3 repeats of the texture pattern, which is basically 12 rows. I did 3 repeats short of where I was, this sweater is knit top down. So 3 repeats short of where I would start to join for the body. So separating out the armholes. Okay. So you could see where the line would have been if I had done the pattern as written. Of course, that also changes in terms of like how much ease you want in your arm. So like if you can imagine, the larger I'm making my armhole, the farther down that line is going if I am literally changing from the yoke color to the body color right at the armpit where I'm joining for the body. Okay, so for my body, I did have a slightly shorter yoke. There's not a bunch of ease here for me. I mean, you know, there's comfort because there's stretch, but baseline, there's not a bunch of ease there. So if I would have, for example, knit my armhole to 20 inches, so 10 inches deep instead of 9 inches deep, I would have even another inch. So it might have even gone slightly below my full bust. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's just a personal preference of what you like. I tend to not like a line right on the fullest part of my bust, so I knew I wanted it to be a little bit shorter. It's also a great way if you do only have 100 grams of your yoke color and you're a larger size. It's kind of a good way to play with that if you want to have it a little shorter. I did add some short rows in the back of the sweater, like right at the neck. And basically I added 4 rows of short rows. So just 1 texture pattern repeat. And so you might be wondering, well, this is not straight stockinette. How do those short rows look? And I will try to show you. Here is wink. Okay. So you can see that like the reversal is very confusing, and since this is open stitching, it is also quite confusing. If that's what I should do to orient myself. Okay, so you can see that point right there. That's the only effect you get from the short rows, is that I have a little point on either side. It's not in any way noticeable when the garment is on. Again, even just looking in the camera just in reverse, I was very confused about being able to find them. And then I added another 4 rows of short rows in the front towards the hem, just to help kind of account for the extra fabric that's needed to go over my bust. Now this garment has quite a lot of, it's knitted a very loose gauge, so you have a lot of, it's a looser, stretchier fabric. So I don't know that it was necessary for me to do that, but whatever, I did. And the reason I did specifically 4 rows was that I did not want to do, it's easiest if you do them in the number of rows in your stitch repeat. So if there's 6 rows in your stitch repeat, it's better to do multiples of 6 on your short rows. And you can see again, so this is the front of the sweater. On the bottom, you can see again, there's another point that is very subtle, especially in the hand spun, I think. So, and normally I would do my short rows a little bit narrower in the front, but I did do them almost for the full width of the front because I knew that texture pattern, I would have a visible point, and it seemed much safer to do that under my arm than like right under my bust line. Okay, so on the vein of like what else I did differently, my gauge is actually different than is suggested, I do believe. Suggested gauge is 15 stitches to 4 inches. So that's a little bit less than 4 stitches to the inch. And my yoke is 5.5 stitches to the inch. So why did I do that? And there's 2 reasons. One reason is I just personally like my knitting to, when it gets to a too loose of a gauge, I tend to pick it and like it doesn't hold up as well for me. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is I knew I had to do a pickup of stitches for this kind of little epaulette kind of detail. And for me, it is very difficult to pick up stitches at a super loose gauge and not have them look very holy. So here is what my like epaulette detail looks like up close. So here you can see the pickup on my yoke is not perfect. Let me tilt so it's more upright looking. So that's the only thing I'm not pleased with. Do I think a non-knitter would notice? No, not at all. Do I think it's very difficult to pick up stitches at this very loose gauge? Yes, yes it is. It's quite difficult. I think I did pretty well for what I was working with. So just wanted you to see that so you could make a determination. Here's the pickup from the I-cord, which looks fabulous, but it's a little bit more challenging there. So you can see, you can still, it's not, if it were a tighter gauge, it would be a better looking pickup. But I don't think at any looser of a gauge, I would have been able to, you know, get that look. Because let's also look at it in the like lying flat state. Because when it's essentially lying flat, it even looks tidier. So when it's lying flat, that looks like a pretty good pickup, right? But as you stretch it out, it's automatically going to look a little bit less even, you know, just like the nature of the fabric. So that's the reason I decided to make my gauge, twofold reason I decided to make my gauge in my top part a little bit snugger. Now, because of that, I was not able to make my sleeve as longer because it took more yarn, essentially, to get that yoke completed. Okay, there was more thread in there. So my sleeve only has 5 repeats before I did the I-cord bind off. So you can see that my sleeve was a little bit shorter. I did still have like 10 grams of the Quince & Company. I could have gotten maybe another repeat before I did, but I just did not want to mess with it. I didn't want to like play the yarn chicken and lose. So I bound off. But yeah. So my actual number of decreases that I did. So I forgot to mention this. I did do decreases in the body. I wanted more of a straight fit or straight look, I guess. And I knew that my gauge changed from my yoke to my body. So my yoke gauge flat is 5.5 stitches. My body gauge is 5 stitches. So if I had just left my stitch counts as is, I would have definitely ended up with more of an A-line look, which is not what I really wanted. So I did do decreases just scattered throughout totally randomly, but mostly on the front of the sweater. I did essentially decrease 3 inches. So the measurement at my armpit is 3 inches larger than the measurement above, slightly above the hem. Now I say slightly above the hem because I think as you wear it, for example, when you knit a traditional sweater, you want -2 inches of ease in the hip, and that's just so that it doesn't stretch out because there's nothing below the hem holding it in, right? So if I hold my sweater up for you, I think you can see. See, there's my armpit, and you can see that I'm decreasing right through here. So that was the most of my decreasing, and I kind of stopped decreasing about there. And then you can see it kind of just naturally comes out a bit just from wear. But on me it does, I don't think it looks necessarily belled. I mean, you saw it on my body. I don't think it looks like it bells out at all. But just to give you an idea, I think if I had not decreased those 3 inches, it would have, you know, been a slightly more diaphanous, you know, give me a little bit more positive ease in the body, which is fine, but I kind of wanted it to match more the less ease that I had in the top, if that makes sense. I didn't want any risk of ruffling. How about that? Didn't want any ruffling, any lettucing of a hem. So I did do those decreases. I did not do like standard bust start decreases or anything like that. I just kind of peppered them through the body, basically just until it felt right to me, which ended up being about 3 inches. Okay, so I think those are the only things I did differently. And you're like, only that was several things, but I just can't ever do things like I'm supposed to. It's a bad habit. I don't know. But I think those are the only things that I did differently. What I would do in the future. So if I were to do another one tomorrow, what would I do? Would I keep those modifications? Would I change them? I think I would keep all of the modifications that I made. So I think I would still knit the top at a tighter gauge, especially the top. The body, I'm not as worried about, but the yoke I would definitely want at a slightly firmer gauge, just because of how I knit. There's no other reason. Just because of how I knit and how I know that I can pick up stitches or not. If you are really concerned about how the pickup looks, you might add another stitch on either side of that little epaulette detail. And so it's a lot easier to get a consistent pickup if you go in a little bit further into the body of your knitting. So for example, instead of picking up right from the edge, go in a stitch and pick up. Okay, that usually gives you a slightly more consistent pickup. But you might also, the great thing about it is you don't have to knit a lot of the sweater before you're doing that part. So it's pretty clear right off, like whether or not you're going to like it. Just be aware that on your body, it's probably going to stretch out a little bit unless you have a lot of positive ease in the sweater already. And then it won't stretch out as much. And what else did I do? What did I do differently? I would do that. Proportions wise, I would definitely stop the yoke shorter. I might even stop it another 4 rows shorter. A, it would give you more wiggle room on your sleeve length. And B, I just don't mind it being a little bit shorter. I may not go as much as half of the yoke depth. For example, on mine, I had 9 stitches before I switched to the body color and then 3 of the body color. So 3/4, 75% of my yoke was in the main color. And then I switched. I don't think I would do less than maybe 2/3 in the main color because I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know that I would like how that, the change in the body color happening in maybe a really visible section on the sleeve, but I would need to look and try to figure that out. But I liked the fact that I didn't mind the way the change in the yoke color looked on the sleeve. Like for example, having the sleeve itself in color A and then having A and B along the sides for the pickup. But I don't know that I would want like half. Like that's always a weird proportion, right? Like 50% is always kind of an odd proportion. It's really chunky looking visually. So I don't think I would do less than 60% of the yoke as the main color, as the yoke color. Does that make sense? But I would definitely feel free coming up another 4. And you're like, wait, that would be 4 and 8. Okay, so that's a third. I'm so good at minding my own advice. Rarely. If I were going to make it a dent, again, I would definitely allow myself at least 150 grams of the yoke color because I would like a slightly longer sleeve. I think a 3/4 sleeve would give me a lot more versatility. And that is mainly, I think, because of my color choices, because of the handspun being very busy. I think that I don't know that I feel completely comfortable wearing like a long sleeve shirt. I have a lot of short sleeve sweaters that I wear long sleeve shirts under, but I don't know that I would want the long sleeve here to be different than the fabric that's coming out from the hem. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Because I just feel like it would be too blocky visually in my head. So I think I would get more versatility out of the sweater if I was able to make at least like a long elbow into a 3/4 sleeve. So that's what I would do, is just allow myself some extra yarn. But again, I am a bigger human than most. So, your mileage will definitely vary. I do think though that the shorter sleeve, I like it without, just like a dress underneath it, which is what I showed you. I think it would also be a little bit useful in the fall, like as we get a little bit cooler in the northern hemisphere. Maybe if I had like a long sleeve chambray shirt dress, or maybe even tunic, but probably shirt dress. I think that would be like a long sleeve shirt under it, or excuse me, a long sleeve dress under this shorter sleeve, I think would be good, because then my arms would visually match my lower body, and I think it would look less blocky to me. That's in my head. I don't know for real. That's in my head. But for example, I did try this on with one of my painted portrait dresses. So those are the dresses that have a lot more gathering under the bodice, or actually like right on the bodice, and sometimes have contrasting side panels, and it was way too busy for me visually with that. Like, it was like just way too much going on. So I did prefer it with a simpler, this was a dress number 1, which is by 100 Acts of Sewing, which I highly recommend. This is the biggest size, the 4X size. I'm so sorry, I keep burping. But I liked it with that less full, and then also just calmer fabric choice. So I think there was a twofold reason I liked it. I think the fullness added, again, texturally to the busyness, whereas the dress number 1 is a definite more A-line, so you don't have as much visual and color texture happening, if that makes sense. I'm just making that up, but I think that's what I think. I don't know. I would definitely do the short rows in the back and on the bottom of the hem again. And I didn't clarify. I did them in the front. The short rows that are lower, closer to the hem, those are in the front to account for bust fabric coverage. I would do longer sleeves. I might do that. Okay, so I think that's all. Sorry, this one was a little bit like, I even planned really well, but for some reason it felt more higgledy-piggledy. I would definitely knit the sweater again. I think it's a great option if you have not knit a sweater yourself, because you have a lot more flexibility and the ease. It's a relatively small yarn commitment. I do recommend that you try on a cropped thing, whether it's a sweater or just play with a t-shirt, like pinning it up shorter, and kind of playing with what that proportion looks like on your body, because I don't have a lot of experience with how it looks on different folks. So I would suggest trying to find something that has a similar shape, just to give you an idea. Like, most of us know what a sweater that hits at the hip is going to look like on us, but many of us have not ever owned a cropped sweater. So you just kind of, if you can find something that's ready to wear just to try on, if you don't have knitters or something like that you have access to, I do recommend that, just to see if you like how the proportion looks. But if you do like how the proportion looks, I think this is a pretty good entry-level sweater. Again, my sweater is 200 grams, so you've probably got 2 skeins of yarn laying around that kind of go together. And you could just kind of experiment a little bit. And again, if it's a little too big, it looked great with positive ease on folks. Mine has on paper negative 1 inch of ease, so that gives you a good amount of wiggle room in your fit. The drop shoulder gives you some wiggle room if you are busty proportionately. Does that work? I think that's, so I would recommend it. It's fun, it's easy, it's not a huge commitment of time or money. And especially for a fingering weight sweater for a big person, that's an exclamation point thing. So yeah,